Hello there, AP World students. Let's learn all about World Wars. Unit 7, Global Conflicts. This is probably my most, I will do the best with this unit. I know possibly too much about the history of the world with World War I and World War II, and let's just jump right into it. All right, here we go, the World Wars. All right, so I'm going to teach you a story about how a grilled cheese sandwich started World War I. If any of you write a grilled cheese sandwich started World War I on a LEQ or a DBQ, you won't get any points from the College Board. But I think this story is just so ridiculous, and everything I'm about to tell you is true, that I have to share it. Okay, so the story goes like this. The Archduke of Austria, the Prince of Austria, his name is Franz Ferdinand. There's a picture of him right there. He and his wife decide to go on a tour through the city of Sarajevo. And Sarajevo has a whole bunch of Bosnian people living in it, and the Bosnians were really pissed off at the Austro-Hungarians because they're like, hey, Austria-Hungaria, we want to be our own nation state. You won't let us be our nation state. We're mad. And the Archduke knew that there could be some danger in this city, but he thought he was invincible or something. So he decided to get in a convertible. If you're a famous person, never drive around in a convertible. Bad things could happen to you. Lots of historical examples there. But anyway, so him and his wife are doing this parade through the town, and you can see in this picture here how close the population got to the parade. And sure enough, in this parade, there's 7 assassins that all have different strategies to try to take him out. And the first assassin sees the prince's car drive by. He throws a grenade at the prince's car. It bounces off the prince's car and blows up in a car full of his bodyguards. Surprisingly enough, none of the prince's bodyguards are killed by that grenade explosion. They're all wounded, though. But this grenade assassin man, he runs into the river nearby. The police are chasing him. He jumps off a bridge into the river, but this is during the height of summer, so the river is only like 2 inches deep. So as he jumps into the river, he breaks both of his legs, and then he tries to drown himself in this 2-inch deep water, and it just doesn't work. Anyway, the police capture this guy. They're pulling him out of the river, and in that moment, he somehow gets a cyanide capsule, throws it in his mouth, but when he bites into the cyanide capsule, the cyanide was old, and it doesn't actually kill him, it just causes him to vomit. So they're pulling this assassin out. They're just calling him the stupidest guy ever. He didn't even hurt the prince. And, okay, so then the prince is just like, oh man, somebody just tried to kill me. What am I gonna do? I'm not gonna worry about it. I'm gonna drive to the middle of town, have lunch with the mayor, enjoy my day. And then one of those other 7 assassins, this guy named Gavrilo Princip, this 17, maybe 19-year-old kid, he watched this whole thing happen. He got really discouraged. He's like, man, we're not going to kill the Austrian prince today. This sucks. So he decides that he's going to go home. But on his way home, he's going to stop by Schneider's Delicatessen and order himself a grilled cheese sandwich. So Gavrilo is eating his grilled cheese sandwich, mind his own business. The prince, on the other hand, decides to cut his lunch with the mayor short. And he says, you know what? I really want to go check on all my wounded bodyguards in the hospital. So he and his wife get back in their convertible car and they tell their driver to drive to the hospital. The driver doesn't know where the hospital is, but rather than ask for directions to the mayor's house, the driver just kind of starts driving along the streets of Sarajevo, doesn't really know where he's going. Eventually, he recognizes that he's lost, so he pulls over in front of Schneider's Delicatessen. And in that exact moment, Gavrilo Princip finished eating his sandwich. He walks right outside the deli, and what's there right in front of him? A convertible car with the Archduke and the princess hanging out in the back seat. So Gavrilo takes out his pistol, and he straight up assassinates himself some Habsburg royalty. And immediately Gavrilo is arrested, and very shortly afterwards, Gavrilo dies in prison. So, that's the story of how World War I began. But you're probably wondering, Mr. Brown, how is it that an archduke getting murdered in the city of Sarajevo ultimately results in a world war? Well, there were these entangling alliances. Every country in Europe had set up this alliance system so that they would all ultimately go to war eventually. Okay? And because of the Archduke's death, this series of events occurred mostly in 1914, but then a couple things happened later, which resulted in the entire world going to war. So, it's, I'm gonna do my best to kind of act this out right now. So it was like this. It was, I am Austria. My son was just killed by a Serbian Bosnian man. We declare war on Serbia. Rah, Austria so angry.
Oh no, little Serbia can't fight on their own. Russia, send help.
Duh, Russia will help you. We attack you, Austria-Hungary. Oh no, Austria-Hungary can't fight alone. Germany, will you help? Oh, Germany will help you. Germany declares war on Russia. Russia cannot fight alone. Russia needs help. France, send help. France will help you. France declares war on Germany. Oh no. Germany cannot fight France alone. Germany will fight you through Belgium. Belgium is your weak spot. You have no defenses there. Germany attacks Belgium.
No, little Belgium, why?
Hey, you can't fight little Belgium. Britain declares war on you now, Germany. Oh, and Japan's getting in on this too, yeah. Oh, the Ottoman Turks, we as a Turks, we will fight now too. Oh, yeah. Buongiorno, Italy joins the game. And then 3 years later, America's in the game now too. So it's just, everybody just kind of responded. I mean, Italy and America were a little bit late to the game, but the whole war the whole world piled in on this world war. All right, moving on. So, yes, and even though those last two slides tell you exactly kind of the spark of the war and the system that started the war, I'm very prepared to make this historical argument that World War I was inevitable. Another name for World War I is the Great War, and also another ironic name for World War I is the War to End All Wars. But that's a really ironic name because there was clearly a World War II that I will get into later in this unit. But yes, World War I was inevitable. And it largely has to do with kind of the apex of the time period of imperialism. Europeans spent all this military effort, they had all this national prestige to kind of plant their flags and conquer all over the world. And once all of Africa and all of Asia was under imperial or European control, the only natural next element is for Europeans to start taking those places from each other rather than from the native peoples of those lands. And you could even really study this. You could look at a lot of documents in the early 1900s, like kind of at the point where Europe had conquered most of the world, but before World War I. And there were so many documents where like British people were talking crap about German people, and Russian people were talking crap about Austrian people. And there was like, they really took social Darwinism to this higher level where they started to dissect different white races as being better than other white races. And it was inevitably going to end in conflict. Inevitably. And every single side began cranking up their militaries, began cranking up their defenses in Europe. Like a war in Europe was going to happen at the beginning of this century. Everybody knew it was coming, and that grilled cheese sandwich thing with the Archduke, that's what really kicked it off. But something else would have done it if that didn't happen on that day. Okay, so the two sides in World War I are the Central Powers, being Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, versus the Allied powers. And when the war started, the Allies were France, Britain, and Russia. Later, Japan, USA, and I should have thrown Italy on there too. They all join up with the Allies later. Russia actually quits the war early, so Russia really wasn't a full ally all the way to the end. But the Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottomans, they were the consistent power. And you can look at this map here. So World War I was the green team versus the orange team. And if you just simply look at the global map, like, orange team doesn't really have a chance, okay? And it's just, yeah, the green team is gonna, the Allied powers are gonna just have so many more resources, so much more connectivity around the world, and the Central Powers aren't gonna hold up in the end. And it's kind of a similar vibe in World War II as well. But Yeah. Oh, and that's a really good debate to have. Which war was the closer war, World War One or World War Two? I mean, they were both very serious conflicts, and either side could have won. And the primary reason is, well, yeah, the Central Powers don't have as much land or territory as the Allies do, but if the Central Powers could just get to the city of Paris, France would have quit the war. And later, Russia does quit the war. So Russia, all this quits the Green Team. And if they got France out of the war, the Allies might have surrendered. So that part about the war is really really serious. All right, moving on. Okay, so when this war officially kicks off, the Germans are the first ones to launch a huge attack. And the Germans know that along their border with France, France built all these defensive forts. So they attack into Belgium, because Belgium, I guess, doesn't have any defenses. And Germany basically takes over all of Belgium. And then, after they get Belgium, they start pushing in through France's northeastern border. Well, the French lose, about 100 miles or so of territory, and the French are retreating. They get about 50 miles away from Paris, and then the French say, you know what, we've got to dig some serious defenses. We're going to create this, well, I don't know if they created the strategy, but they definitely used the strategy of trench warfare. And here's a bunch of pictures of trenches at the bottom of the slide. It's guys digging giant ditches to protect their soldiers from attacks. And they found out trenches were really good. So the Germans were like, oh man, like we can't attack the French anymore right now. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go about 100 yards away from the French, and we're going to dig our own trenches to make sure that the French can't push us back, and we'll lose the land we took from France so far. So not only did they dig one trench about 100 yards away from each other, each side dug reserve trenches. And I think I remember reading somewhere that they dug like 50 reserve trenches. So they just turned all of eastern France into this incredible defensive trench network that went all the way from the coast of the English Channel to the border of Switzerland. And this huge trench network in France was called the Western Front. And this is what World War I is all about, kids. It's about this crazy trench warfare in France. I'll deep dive into this some more. So let's check it out. Okay, so the trench warfare thing gets started, and both sides realize that playing defense is way easier than playing offense. These trenches are really, really effective at holding the line. And so both sides decide, like, okay, what are we going to do to get around trench warfare? We're going to have to make some new inventions to kind of solve these military concerns. And also, this is the first time in world history that Europeans are totally going to war with each other, and they've got fully industrialized economies. So they decide to put all their efforts of their factories and their economies into fighting this war. And a lot of new tools for death and destruction came out of these factories. And here, I've got them all listed on the side here. So flamethrowers were invented during World War I. Fighter airplanes were invented during World War I. I mean, they had airplanes before, but they're finally like, hey, let's put machine guns on these things. Attack blimps. The Germans were especially big on those. There's a picture of a blimp bombing London. They made submarines to be really effective during this war. Poison gas. Oh, it's the worst. Heavy machine guns. And, I mean, they had machine guns before, but now these are machine guns that are shooting like 30 bullets in 1 second. It's just ridiculous how many bullets are flying out of these things. These giant artillery cannons. Here's one hooked up to a train car. And I know that even in World War I, the Germans made artillery cannons that could shoot 50 miles away. And they were actually bombarding Paris, almost the whole war. And then at the very end of World War I, they made tanks. Tanks are kind of the answer to trench warfare. That's a picture of an early tank down there. And but those only came pretty later on. They were really unreliable at first, too. But so many new inventions came out of World War I. I'm going to argue more inventions came out of World War I than came out of World War II. And a lot of this stuff has really changed the scope of warfare for the rest of human history. Okay, so the Western Front was more or less the same for the next 4 years. for the next 4 years, both sides, the Germans, the French, the British, were just fighting along in those trenches, trying their best to run all those 100 yards away, attack the enemy trench, force the guys out. They take a trench, but then, well, the other guys already have another trench set up behind. So, yeah, the entire war of World War I was just fought in eastern France. The Allies did eventually take most of that land back throughout the war, but it was always just an incredible cost of human lives. The way trench warfare works is these guys would get out of their trench, they would run at the enemy trench, and then they'd all just get machine gunned down, or they'd get attacked by poison gas, they'd get attacked by artillery cannons, they'd get attacked by planes. There was just 100 ways to die on the Western Front, and very, very few guys ever succeeded in attacking an enemy position. It was just this cycle of dead soldiers, and it's really, really sad how that happened. The top example of just this grinder of human death was the Battle of the Somme. It was the biggest battle of World War I, and it was this battle where the British and the French said, we're gonna just push something like 3 million men into this one part of the German trenches to try to force the Germans to retreat out of their trenches, and we can take them and we can start winning the war. Well, they launched just, so many artillery shells at the German trenches. They launched gas at the German trenches. They even had some of the early tanks during this battle. They tried everything they could. And then when the British guys got out of their trenches and ran at the Germans still had their machine guns. They still had their defenses. And 60,000 men died in the first hour of that battle. It's just huge amounts of human destruction. And the Battle of the Somme still is the deadliest day in all of world history of soldier versus soldier warfare. Just lots and lots of people ran out at the enemy trench and just wasted their lives. So, pretty sad stuff. But the Western Front is largely how the British, the Germans, and the French fought throughout the entirety of this war. Okay, Russia's experience. I've already said earlier in this presentation, Russia eventually quits. And it's largely because the last king of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, I think this is a picture of the guy, maybe. But anyway, Russia was totally unprepared for World War I. I actually listened to this mini documentary this morning where some guy was saying, Russia was actually pretty good. I disagree with the man. I remember reading some primary sources that Russian soldiers were sent into battle with knives and 50-year-old rifles. These Russians, they don't have the military technology that the French, the British, and the Germans had. And a lot of Russian people lost confidence in the Tsar's ability to lead. So they decided to start their own revolution against him, which resulted in a civil war happening in Russia during World War I. Russia decided to focus on that civil war. They surrendered huge amounts of their land to Germany, and so they got out of World War I, gave all that land to Germany, so then Germany could focus even more of its efforts on trying to push the Allies in France along the Western Front. And I'll bring up some more of Russia's experience later, once I tell you the outcome of that civil war. That'll probably happen in the next video. Okay, the Ottoman Empire. This is kind of their last hurrah in world history. The Ottoman Empire had been losing a lot in the last 400 years. I told you kids all about how China had a rough time during imperialism. The Ottoman Empire just kind of stayed out of everything. They didn't really industrialize so much. I mean, they did have a lot of interesting reforms, but they were definitely technologically far behind all of the other powers during World War I. They largely fought a defensive war, tried to hold on to their possessions in the Middle East, but slowly the Allies were pushing up against them in the Middle East. And the British famously inspired the Arab people to rise up against the Ottomans. So the Ottomans were dealing with kind of these little revolts all during World War I. But something I do have to point out for the Ottomans, they did have one very successful battle called the Battle of Gallipoli. A force of Australian and New Zealand soldiers. This is kind of their first foray into world history. Australian and New Zealand soldiers invaded Turkey at a place called Gallipoli, and the Turks stopped them. The invasion never really got much far past the beaches, and the Australians and New Zealanders lost a whole lot of people trying to fight there. And also in Gallipoli, the Ottomans made trenches, and they made machine gun nests, and they got some gas from the Germans, and they used all that same stuff. So, that was really, really, really rough for Australians. But, yep. All right, Battle of Gallipoli. Moving on. Okay. So, the Allied powers, they utilized men from their colonies to serve as auxiliary soldiers to help fight in the Western Front and also in the Middle East and all other parts around the world. These soldiers were promised all kinds of freedoms. They were promised pay. They were promised pensions. If they were to die, then their families would get money. But the Allies largely forgot about a lot of those promises. It was sort of like, hey, we just need people to fight in the trenches. Maybe we'll take a couple Germans. Maybe we'll just take German bullets, whatever. So that was really, really messed up. The Central Powers didn't really have access to all those colonies, so that was a huge disadvantage for them in World War I. It's just Allies had more land, more resources, and more people to count on. And I'm going to bring this up because a lot of these soldiers who fought for the Allies, their promises were broken during World War I. And, these guys are still alive. If they survived World War I, they're still alive during World War II, and they're going to remember these broken promises and not be as inclined to help the Allies in the Second World War. Wartime propaganda. This is a really interesting concept. Every side in World War I used it. These are pictures, movies, songs. They always demonize the enemy. They encourage the population to participate in the war effort. I actually have a lot of tame propaganda here because most wartime propaganda is really racist. I know in the United States, for example, during World War I, it was illegal for people to listen to Beethoven or Wagner music because those are, the music of the enemy. And, my grandfather served in World War II, and I remember when I was in middle school, I brought a manga comic book over to his house, and he told me how dare you read Japanese stuff in my house? And I'm like, the war was over 40 years ago, Grandpa, but he didn't care. He was still mad. So so it's this propaganda, always the intention is to mold your citizens' minds. And it's interesting if you highlight some propaganda today. There's definitely some movies in the United States that are certainly still considered propaganda. It always tries to enforce an argument about sort of who the good guy is, who the bad guy is. And it's especially interesting to look at propaganda from our enemies' perspectives during these wars of the past, just to see sort of the negative things they were saying about the United States and about Britain. So anyway, this is what propaganda is. Check out all these pictures. I think they're kind of interesting. All right, moving on. So, total war. This is a very important concept, and it's sort of when your entire economy mobilizes to fight in a war. This was used by just about every country in the world during World War I and World War II. Even neutral countries that weren't participating in the war, they sold bullets and guns and food to the countries that were fighting in the war. So they really were like, hey, every single person in the economy, you gotta do your part. You gotta help the job. You gotta work. So the entire economy transformed into supporting the war effort. I know that a pretty common thing in a total war scenario is they close luxury shops, they close resorts, every single job people do in a country, it has to be a job that in some way supports the war effort. I would imagine Las Vegas as a city, a lot of our main industries would probably close, okay? People really wouldn't want to have hotels and gambling in a time of total war. Every single person should be working in a factory, or serving on the front lines, or helping soldiers, helping the country win the war. All countries did this, but the USA took it to an extreme in World War II. I'm going to bring some more concepts from total war in the United States in the third video of this series. But everybody got a job to help the war effort in some way. Country leaders got on the radio. They encouraged patriotic messaging frequently. Everybody's just saying, do your part, fight. And if you don't serve, then your community hates on you and shuns you and kind of disowns you. But I do even remember my uncle, who was 4 years old during World War II. He searched for scrap in the dump, and he turned it in a factory, and they switched that scrap into bullets. So, I mean, you even have kindergartners searching through a dump trying to find scrap metal. That's some pretty hardcore stuff, kids. That's what a total war economy is, and just about everybody in the world is doing stuff like that. All right, so now let's talk about a very relevant thing for the year of 2020. The Great Influenza Pandemic, also known as the Spanish Flu of 1918. So this actually happened during World War I, and every single year people get sick from influenza, but for reasons that scientists don't entirely know, the strain in the year 1918 was exceptionally widespread and exceptionally deadly. And probably a reason why it was so widespread, actually, is because the whole world was moving stuff to help fight in the Western Front, and people from all over the world were going there. So the disease will probably spread faster just because of this whole global mobility trying to help out France or to fight in France. But this is the most deadly pandemic in recent world history. 50 million people died from this pandemic. And unlike the COVID-19 pandemic, the Spanish flu killed people mostly between the ages of 20 to 40. Young people and old people generally were saved from the Spanish flu, but people of prime working age were widely susceptible to it. And I think I do remember I read some stuff about this, and it's that the Spanish flu of 1918 responded to people who had fully realized immune systems, and their immune systems turned against their bodies. So little kids don't have fully utilized immune systems, and old people don't have fully utilized immune systems either. And an interesting thing too is while this pandemic was going on, a lot of countries actually downplayed it because they wanted to focus on finishing the war. So and the war still remained the primary focus of just about all societies in the world. And they just were like, people are dying from a disease, whatever. Keep throwing stuff at the Germans. But there definitely were some national responses to this pandemic. I mean, look, all theaters closed until further notice. People wearing masks. This is more than 100 years ago. Here's a bunch of kids staying home from school, reading a book about geography, listening to the radio because there were radio teachers in 1918. That would be way harder than online learning. I just admit that. And there's a little sign right there. It says, has endangered the war in Europe. Don't spit. Yeah, people thought that if you spit, you'd get the disease. Or here's a guy saying, wear a mask, so this is, it's sort of like maybe every 100 years, there's always going to be a pretty crazy disease that sweeps through the world. And this certainly was the one in 1918, or in the early 1900s. Yeah, no doubt. Okay, so I'm not going to get into too much of the fighting and the other battles of the war. I already told you, the vast majority of the war was fought in the Western Front, and the front kind of stayed stable during the entirety of the war. But some other events that were happening, though, was the Ottomans were losing a lot of land. They were considering surrender. They didn't really have any ability to push out and fight back. The Germans, they were running out of food and medicine, and especially to fight the pandemic. The Germans, they were suffering so many losses at home, and a lot of specialized medicine to fight disease you need to get from other parts of the world, and the Germans didn't have that accessibility. Also, the United States was training 3 million additional soldiers, and the Germans heard about that, and they were like, I don't know if we can fight 3 million more guys in the Western Front. We might have to surrender. And this is the most interesting point, though, is the fighting never got into Germany, okay? The fighting was still in France, and the German high command was like, okay, well, if we just surrender the war now, the Allies will be more nice to us, rather than if we, fought the war all the way to the end and had kind of a last stand and and made the Allies invade Germany. If we just quit the war now, say we surrender, maybe we can have a more amicable terms of the surrender and the Allies will treat us better. So, but that would be a wrong thought by the German High Command, as history will later prove. Okay, so this will be my last slide today. The Allied powers, Germany said, okay, we surrender. They accepted Germany's surrender. And almost immediately after that, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. But the German government was still largely in charge. So the Allies sort of only really could make a proper peace terms and could kind of impose punishments on Germany because the new governments in what will become Turkey and what will become Austria, they kind of disavowed the old system that brought them into the war in the first place. But the Allied powers met in the old palace of the kings of France. They met specifically in the most famous room in the world. I hope you kids remember which room that is. And they debated what should happen that the war is over. There were some pretty serious disagreements. The American president at the time, he actually didn't like any of these terms. He wanted to be a lot nicer to Germany. But the British and the French delegation, they suffered lots of casualties during the war. And the French Prime Minister, a guy named Clemenceau, he was especially salty about the Germans. He was like, oh my gosh, we have to punish them. They destroyed France. France will never recover. But actually, to a degree, like, even to this day, there are parts of eastern France that have unexploded bombs in them, and the land is just generally unusable. So that's really kind of scary. But these are the terms of the war. Germany needed to admit complete responsibility for World War I. If you remember my story earlier this year, I mean, Germany kind of was like the third or fourth person to join up in the war. Germany was also no longer allowed to have a military of any significance. And if you know anything about German history, they're all about, like, military pride, so Germany wouldn't like that. Germany would lose all of their overseas colonies and 25% of their land in Europe. France took some land, Poland took some land, Denmark took some land, so Italy, I think, even took some land. So like Germany was like, what the heck, you're taking our land? Like, our people love being a part of Germany. But probably the most serious one was Germany was forced to pay France $265 billion. And the crazy thing is, Germany actually did finish paying those fees in the year 1995. Like, I was in, like, middle school when Germany stopped paying their World War I reparations. Like, wow, that's crazy to me. So I think I'll just propose this question to you. Do you kids think these were fair peace terms on Germany for the end of World War I? And that's where I'll leave it for this video. Peace out.